Scorecard on American Public Schools. How do we really fare in international comparisons? Co-sponsored by AADL and the University of Michigan Department of Psychology.
Thank you for this nice introduction. So I put you at ease. There's not much statistics here, right? So I'm trying to keep that really to a minimum. Some slides I will have to explain a little bit statistics, but that is actually not my statistics. I will report, some of the slides are from my own research, but I will mainly report from 3 large studies, and I will explain why that is that we cannot do this kind of research in Michigan. So who in the audience is a teacher? Was. Thank you for your service. You know, it's always when I give talks and I make that joke, thank you for the service, and then people would think it's funny, and I say, well, if people in the military, if I would have scorecard of the American military, of course people would say, well, you served in the Army, thank you for your service, because teaching is a hard profession, and I'm doing this kind of research for over 25 years, and this is one thing I learned. Teaching is really difficult. I am not a very good teacher. I have a student here sitting here, so say that's not true. But teaching high school, I've seen so many lessons, thousands of lessons from other teachers teaching. And for the most part, I have to say, I could not teach as well, despite the fact that I am an undergraduate teacher. But in high school, in particular K to 12, when I have learned a lesson, then it is really respect for the profession of teaching in my work. So having said that, what I want to do today is I want to just ease us in to what is the rationale of international comparison in the education system. Why are we doing this? Why do we spend, as a society in the United States, but also worldwide, an incredible amount of money on doing this kind of research? And then, of course, once we have established why we're doing this, of course, we're curious and nosy, like, wow, how do we do in the United States, right? So, I typically do not like to give presentations where we have this horse race of, who comes in first and second, because I think it's not really, in the end, it is not very helpful. But of course, I make concessions. I will do a little bit of that, but then I, steer us away a little bit and, try to give you at least an idea what a scientific perspective on this issue is. And so I will go over school achievement. This is mainly 15-year-olds, 8th graders, for reasons that I will explain. And then I want to talk about some myths that we have or I think a lot of people have, so I'm kind of sniffing a little bit, what typically in media, misconceptions about the educational system in the United States and worldwide. So we'll talk briefly about investment in education overall, how we fare with that, so just not only about school achievement. I will also talk about college attendance and the transition to the workforce. As Chris nicely pointed out, that my interest in the school system is not just how does the student achieve, but how much does that really matter? How much bang they get, for their life course? How much does that, set them up for a positive trajectory? Or sometimes, how do we set up children for failure? And this is something that you only see if you look, 10, 15 years after, in this case, middle school. And if we have time, we'll dig a little deeper into gender differences, because that's a topic that I find is very, enlightening and also showcases what we can really learn from these kind of international comparisons. All right. So first of all, I need you to, give me a number. So since it's school, right? School is grades. So what do you think? What grade does our school system deserve? A, outstanding, innovative, an example for the world. B, strengths and weaknesses are similar to other Western nations. C, seriously flawed, particularly compared to other countries. Or D, fundamentally broken, shortcomings jeopardizing the future of our nation. So who, No, you know what I want? I want you to take a deep breath, and on my count, on 3, you just shout out your letter. 1, 2, 3.
B.
I heard something between B and C the most. And I will, in the end tell you what my grade would be. And I will, justify why. So why do we do international comparisons and pay so much money? Well, first of all, we are all experts in school, aren't we? If you are my age or a little older, you graduated in the 60s, that would have been your high school picture. If you're, graduated, in the 1980s, that would be your experience. And for those of you who have lived long enough, know that, somehow the feel of school has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. So the problem is, we are all experts, but as we say as empirical researchers, well, this is an n=1 problem. You have your own experience, and that is certainly a true experience. You might even have, if you have children, you might have, 1, 2, 3, how many children you have, more additional experiences that you can talk about. But that's not very much. So how do we often generalize easily to the entire, in the United States, education. Well, it doesn't even suffice if you have good knowledge about the education system in your own state, because, we have huge variation between states, which, by the way, I will not talk about tonight. But only a few people have really experienced another school system, meaning they have moved in their childhood or adolescence, from, I have a graduate student, she moved when she was 14 from Korea to the United States. Very interesting. I love always to talk to her because she has an experience that I don't have. And not many people are familiar with educational research on that, like, myself. So we have to be always very careful in not generalizing or overgeneralizing from our own experience. And this is one of in the political discussion, unfortunately, a very common problem, that people always overgeneralize from their own experience. And this is, what you have scientists for, right? To kind of correct for that. So I mentioned already that national comparison or making claims about the nation as such is already difficult. Now multiply this by 45, if you have 45 nations, when you want to do international comparison. Then the problems get even worse. Because there are at least 4 things you have to make sure of before you actually can look at data that were collected. First of all, when you want to compare, let's say, science achievement in the United States with science achievement in Japan, well, unless you have the entire population collected, you need sampling procedures, and those sampling procedures have to be comparable. Not identical, but they have to be strictly comparable. Because otherwise you find mean differences and they don't mean anything. So the sampling, is already a problem that is not very easy to solve without really, a lot of manpower. Then if you want to focus on students' achievement, well, there is not just something like math or science or reading comprehension. Well, the tests that are used, they have to be fair. Fair in a sense, what the students actually were supposed to learn. So if you have, in math and science, it's perhaps there is some convergence, strong convergence in the curriculum, but if you do research on civic education, what civic education involves is very different. The pedagogy of civic education is very different across nations, and you will have a hard time finding a core curriculum that you can develop tests that produce results that are arguably comparable. So that is already difficult. But then there comes also this thing, but since we invest a lot of money, governments pay for this kind of research, and of course, what will happen is, governments have a vested interest in the findings, and what will happen is often that they try to influence the process. So you also have to make sure that the data collection, there is no cheating. That if a research team that gets paid by the government, the government does not like to have the news out that they are mediocre in math achievement a year prior to election. It's understandable. It's something as scientists we cannot tolerate. So I don't have the time to go into the details how this is done, but I think we are actually, over the course of the last 40 years, got very good at monitoring this. One key feature that good studies have is that the data processing does not happen in those nations. They provide the raw data to an independent organization, and they process the data, and they do some checks to make sure that the data are actually accurate. Another issue that comes up occasionally is also when in most studies have, between 30 and 45 nations involved, you have to translate questionnaires and tests into more than 30 languages, sometimes within a country into 2 or 3 different languages. So, that you lose something in translation is not just a minor thing in these studies. Not as much for the test items, if you have an achievement test, but for the questionnaires, because we also want to know how do students, how much do they like learning? How much, do they think that learning is relevant for their future? So we also ask them questions, about their belief systems, and their translations, become very important. They can really change the results by just changing, simple vocabulary. So by now, you should not be surprised that I tell you that this can only be done by international organizations. Only they have the funding, the money, and the manpower and organizational structure to pull this off. And there are 2 major organizations who do international comparative studies. I have to say, who do this in the way, on the level that we scientists actually believe the data. There are a lot of people do this. I have done this myself. You visit a colleague in Tel Aviv, and oh, let's collect some data, and you collect some data in an hour, and then you write a paper together. That's fine, but one has to be aware that these so-called convenience samples, they are not comparable, and you cannot make them comparable. So it's very difficult to really analyze these data. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is an organization that I don't know, most of you might be familiar with it. This is an organization that is a consortium of all Western industrialized nations. And what their main concern is economic cooperation. So they care about free trade agreements, and they usually are not in the business of school and education. However, the OECD at one point in the late 1980s thought, well, when we talk about flow of capital between industrialized nations, we also have to, look at the human capital. If you just imagine that, every 40 years or so, the entire workforce is replaced by the next generation. So after 40 years, you have to make sure you have enough engineers, enough computer scientists, enough doctors, enough tax accountants, maybe not, I don't know. But this is clear that the reproduction of our workforce is even more important the more industrialized or developed a country is. So this is clear why the OECD became interested in that. And they have basically 2 main studies. The one is called PISA, and this is a study of 15-year-olds. And 15-year-olds for a very simple reason, because this is internationally the age where in almost all countries, also developing countries, school education is mandatory. So after age 15, it depends on the countries whether further education is compulsory, and you have people leaving, the school track. So that's the main reason why we look at 15-year-olds in general, because that is an important age. Then there's a study that's called PIAAC, and PIAAC is an adult study that I just mentioned it because I have 2 or 3 slides that pull from this data set. This is a cross-sectional. That means it's just a one-time point adults from age 16 to 64 trying to be representative for various countries, in this case I think even 60 countries, and to see how education translates into future earnings. That's basically what the OECD basically looks at as a dependent variable for adults. And of course, it makes sense that if you have a successful educational trajectory, it should turn into something. Well, you might just, be more spiritually, enlightened. That's one thing. But what the OECD is interested, that's not their main interest. They want to see, do those people really get into high-paying jobs? And, how much does it put you at risk if you don't finish high school in our modern society? Or is it possible that you make a living and, decent living even without a degree? The second organization is, and this is really a mouthful, the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Attainment, or Achievement, sorry. This is the older of the two institutions. The IAA is a consortium that grew out of a handful of professors, international professors in Western Europe. And they say, well, we would like to do some comparison across nations. And we are talking now at the end, in the 1959, 1960, when they had the first conferences. And the first studies that they did were basically, now we look down on this, because they were basically not worth looking at the results, because they had all these sampling problems. So they had a very steep learning curve. Initially, the first international math study in the 1964. The report reads, it's very bizarre. Then there is no representative sample of the United States. It's all from Massachusetts. And if you know something about the educational system in the United States, Massachusetts is perhaps the state that stands out with the highest achievement. So they had no representative samples. However, the IAA has also, in competition with the OECD, really learned a lesson. And now they have a cycle that is the TIMSS cycle. They look at fourth graders and eighth graders and follow them and look at their achievement in math and science. They focus on math and science. While the OECD and PISA, you see they have math, science, and reading. So you would think, well, this must be redundant. Don't they do the same thing? They also have a lot of countries that participate in both studies. Yes and no. I will not go too much deeper into this because I use them interchangeably in my slides. But the PISA approach is slightly different. You can see I said this here, that the 15-year-olds, this is the population in PISA. It's all the kids who are 15 years old in those nations, whether they're in school or not, they don't care. The TIMSS study is what we call curriculum-based. So they compare the curriculum in those school subjects and devise tests that basically speak to the curriculum of those countries and try to be fair to the international and national curricula. So for us educational researchers, TIMSS has a little bit of leg up because we can actually see how differences in achievement relate to actual practice of teaching. In PISA, it is possible that 15-year-olds do very well, but not because the school system is good, because they have just parents who teach them. So all these compensatory relationships between the school system, and if the school system is weak, that you could have family systems, the OECD has no information about that. So technically speaking, it's the IAA studies that actually try to keep the link to the educational system or to the public school system, and the OECD is a little bit more loosey-goosey about that. However, and this is the way how these studies basically advertise themselves, however, when you look at the findings of those countries that participate in both countries, in both set of countries, countries that participate in both studies, you'll see that the findings are almost the same. Not exactly the same, but very, very similar. So lo and behold, these differences are only important when you're an educational researcher. If you're only interested in education and on an international comparison, as a non-scientist, the differences will look minor to you. The IAA has, just to mention this, many, many other studies, computer technology use, civic education. They have, they're a little broader. The OECD only focuses on those school subjects that they consider relevant for the reproduction of the workforce. So music education is also something that the IAA does that the OECD is not really interested in. So if you look at the map, these are all the countries that are part of the PISA and PIAAC study. Ignore the shades. This is only whether they are actually OECD countries. They are part of the organization, and the blue ones are countries that participate in PISA, but they are only partner nations. But this is, you see, there is quite widespread around the globe, with the exception of Africa. So Africa is, in this regard, always a blind spot. This is the IAA TIMSS study. You see Africa is a little bit better represented. But TIMSS has Latin America is a little missing. So these two studies also dovetail nicely with respect to the coverage of nations that they compare. So these three studies, PISA, TIMSS, and PIAAC, They have a lot of things in common. They are all snapshot pictures. They are cross-sectional. That means they always look at one age group. In TIMSS, it's a little better. They have two age groups. They have the 4-year-olds, the fourth graders, and the eighth graders. They do, since they are done now routinely, repeatedly, that is what we call a trend analysis. They are not, unfortunately, not longitudinal. Longitudinal would mean I have the same kids and I look at them really, really as they age. A trend is I have the 15-year-olds in 2000, in 2003, 2006, but these are always different children. So we cannot, with most of these studies, we cannot make real claims from a developmental psychological perspective, but sometimes we can, extrapolate that. So, but the reason, this is why I put this caveat here, so causal claims we have to be very careful with because we do not have really longitudinal data in these studies. So, and therefore these studies are usually only useful if we have additional information about the school system. So on the level of systems, we need to really add, put some more information on the table, and this is the point where I often go and I pilfer from the OECD information about the nations and combine them with the data from TIMSS, because the national data about, for example, how much of the GDP is invested in education, the economic data, they are relevant for both studies. But to really, that one of the Achilles heels of all these studies is once you want to talk about, what do we need to do to change things, one has to be very careful. And we are often assigned as very kind of circumspect and careful in doing this. Different from journalists who then, read these studies. And I have stopped reading this, following this, because it gives me an ulcer when I, read that every second sentence is actually not supported by the data, or at least not to the claims they are made are not justified. Well, now we are already at my second big topic. So, okay, without further ado, what is it? Now, how good are we, right? So I picked 3 indicators, achievement of the 15-year-olds, math, science, and reading. I want to show you some historic trends. Then, a little bit about the macro structure of education. And then we'll talk about the college years. So, before we delve into those slides, here's my little statistic lesson. It's not long, so you will hang in there. So the nice thing about the OECD and IAA, 20 years ago, they have agreed to report the results on the same scale, and the scale is like temperature, Fahrenheit or Celsius. There is some arbitrariness, in particular, what a 0 score means, and there is no such thing as zero education. So they have decided an arbitrary mean value of 500. So 500 is in every study, 500 is the overall mean of the entire sample across all nations. And the standard deviation, which is the measure of how much variability you have in the data, is defined to be 100 for the entire data set. So this is, of course, a very abstract statistic. And unless you have statistics training, it will be very difficult for you to understand that. But there is a very nice shorthand to understand what this means. Because when you have one school year, this is my third bullet point here, 1 year of schooling typically brings you up a third of a standard deviation. So if you have 2 countries and they are apart, let's say one country has a mean score of 500 and the other country has a score of 530, that would be roughly the equivalent of 1 school year. So the 8th graders in one country, they perform at the level of 9th graders of the other country. And this gives you an immediate sense of, what differences are really important. So if you have 5-point difference, that might be statistically significant, but that's not really relevant, because it would, if you translate this into, time of schooling into 2 or 3 weeks, well, big deal, Your daughter, has an appendicitis, she's in the hospital for 2 weeks, and you can compensate for these lapses. So that would not be a big difference between countries. Another important thing for my presentation today is we do not only, as educational researchers, we are not only interested in the average level of educational achievement. Of course, we are also interested in the equity aspect of it. What you want is equity and excellence. You want a nation to be having a very high score, but very little variance, a very small standard deviation. You want all the students to be really excellent. Not just some are excellent, or some are super excellent, and some are kind of mediocre and bad, and then on average, the country looks good. For the reproduction of the workforce, as I introduced you to this rationale of these studies earlier, this is not the only thing to having excellence and average. You also want to have everybody to be as close as possible to that high score. So what we want is equity and excellence, and that means translated into these scores that I'm gonna torture you with now is you want a high M, a high mean score, and you want a small or low number for the standard deviation. So the last point, I'll show you this at the graph. This is an awful graph. This is PISA 2006 science. They don't report these data like this anymore. But just to orient you, for most slides, I just put the dot where the United States is. So this is science achievement. I use this graph only basic to introduce you to the rationale of these studies. So here you have the 45 nations, and you see that they are ordered in the sequence of the highest mean score. This bar here is the mean score. Around this is the standard error, that's not important. But you also see here, this is a measure of the threat. This is very simple to understand. This is the 5th percentile, so this is where the lowest 4% are below, and this is the 95th percentile. If you have kids with SAT scores, you know what I'm talking about. The 95th percentile, only 5% are higher. So what we want in terms of equity and excellence, we want a country to have a high mean score and a narrow margin. So this bar should be small, right? So and then you see, here, for example, this is, oh wow, this is a very small variance, and this is Switzerland. Has a small, no, it's not Switzerland. This is Macau, China. Of course, that makes more sense. And what you see here, the horizontal line here, this is the overall average of 500, which has in and of itself no real meaning. But what I want to point out is let's start with Finland, because this is a very popular country to look at for various reasons. You see that the Finnish students in science, 15-year-olds, they scored 554 compared to the average. So these are how many points more? 54. This is 1.5 school years. So we're not talking peanuts, right? So the United States, on the other hand, we are, somewhere in the middle. In this particular study, we are slightly below. And in most recent data, actually, we are faring a little better. But you also see that the United States, in terms of the variability, is not, super. Our band is, relatively large, but there are other nations that are even worse than we are. So we are in the middle, and then typically what journalists say, we are mediocre. Okay, you can say we are mediocre, but you will see that this is, not the whole story here. You also can see that when you look at the top performers, you see the East Asian countries, Hong Kong, China, Chinese Taipei, Japan, Korea, those countries will come up more than once, that the East Asian countries, perform very well. I'm quite sure you all have heard about that. And if you look at the other end, that's where we often do not talk about that much. That is very often the really developing countries, in Northern Africa, Jordan, and a lot of countries in South America and the former Soviet bloc. Next thing, this is now we are, fast forward, 2015. This is the most recent data. They were actually released a couple of months ago. And this is important to look at. This is the scores in PISA, in the PISA study for science, math, and reading parallel. The PISA study has one nifty thing. Every 3 years, they collect data, and they always focus either on math or science, on reading as the main focus of the report, but they collect data for all the 3 subjects every time. And what you see is if you look at the top, Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada, Finland, Singapore, Japan, Estonia, Finland. You will see that if you look at, intuitively, you will see that these rank orders are very similar across subjects. They're not identical, so there can be countries that are, have some strength, relative strength in one of the three, but overall the correlation is 0.70. It will not, if you don't know statistics, it doesn't really tell you much, but it's a strong correlation. And you see that the United States, relatively speaking, in math, we're relatively weak. You see 470, this is below the 500. But in reading and in science, we are fairly good. However, as it always is, here's the average. We are slightly above average. Statistically not significantly different from the average. And in math, we are slightly below. Well, while international comparisons in and of themselves, there are always rational reasons why, we don't do that well. And of course, why would we compare our nation with Japan or China or Korea, culturally very different nations? But the problem for us is a little bit Canada, because a lot of the arguments don't apply. But you see that Canada is really at the top 20% of the countries, despite the fact that their educational system, their history is very similar, the educational system is similar, and many of the challenges of the educational system are similar. So Canada, if there's one take-home point from tonight, is do not look East Asia. It's not, stay closer to home. Canada is perhaps, an educational system where we could potentially learn something from. And I'm very, happy to talk about this in the discussion if you have questions. Because this is, of course, it's once I would start, I had a couple of slides prepared, and I thought, no, this is, it's a complex issue. What's not so complex is another finding that often also, or rarely gets reported, if not even, I don't think ever, in Time magazine talks about education, or even, news outlets, is always about the achievement. But what people do not talk about is these questionnaires that we also run in these studies. And one of the striking findings is, take a look at Korea. Really a high-achieving country is always on top of the achievement scale. But as a developmental psychologist, I have a very simple question. Well, are the students actually happy at school? Do they like to go to school? Do they see, and this is the one from my own study, do they have a sense of belonging to the school? It's very simple questions, When you get up in the morning, are you looking forward to go to school, yes or no? And here's something really perplexing. You see that all these high-performing countries, this is China, Macau, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea is here somewhere also, South Korea, they do very badly in these psychological variables, very poorly. So, well, the United States did not take part in that particular questionnaire study, but countries that I know very well, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, Iceland, they all in the positive range. So, at this point, you could say, well, we are not achieving that well, but our students love to go to school by comparison. So these East Asian students, they might perform well, but they just don't like school. And these differences, this so-called Z-scores, those are really remarkable differences. And I actually recently published a paper where we demonstrate indirectly that these differences are not artifacts of, for example, translation. Because these questionnaire data, they really change by translation. But even if those of you familiar with foreign languages, if you have Chinese, and South Korean Chinese is a character-based language, Korean is an alphabetic language. So they are very different. And so if it were a problem of translation, then you would typically see that one or two nations fall out. Let's say all the character-based, that would be Japan and China. So I don't believe that this has something to do with mistakes in translation. I think this is very real. And it's also, every time we collect these data, we find this, for over 20 years, always the same findings in both studies, in PISA as in TIMSS. So high-achieving nations, it is not, the correlation is not very high across nations, but in particular those East Asian nations, they have a problem on their own, that the students do not like to go to school. And we can discuss later why that is. So how did we develop over the last years, in this case, last 20 years? So this is now the TIMSS study. As I said, I use them, go back and forth between the two studies. The TIMSS data, we have the longest trend series here since 1995. This was the first TIMSS study. And then every 4 years we see that. And you see that the score slightly went up from 492 to 509. So, half to 3/4 of a school year, improvement in the trend for 15-year-olds. So that's good news, have improved in math. And math is arguably, one of the key school subjects, at least the OECD always claims that is the best predictor of educational success. If you pick one school subject, math would be your choice. So, and you see that other countries like England, also improved a little bit, but not, as clearly as we did. But now comes, of course, the comparison. I tried to put these graphs so that the scale, that this is really, to scale here, 560. So you see in South Korea, despite the fact that they already started in a different league from us, this is a 70-some points difference. This is, if I typically at that point don't talk about school years. This is over 2 school years. This is, a little bit out of proportion, but the remarkable differences initially. And you would have assumed in 1995, actually I assumed back then, okay, so they are reaching a ceiling. They cannot go further up. But no, they do. So, and quite substantially again, right? So in terms of achievement, yes, look at Korea and all is good. But I told you earlier, 2 slides ago, right? There is a catch in the Korean system. But when it comes to achievement, we have to be honest. So, okay, we have slight improvement over 20 years, but not to the extent that some East Asian countries have improved. Japan, for example, has basically, went up and down. So now I'm coming to the topic that we scientists are always very interested in, and that is the combination of equity and excellence. Excellence is one thing, but we want also to make sure that we are equitable. So this is, where here this is a measure of socioeconomic background, strength of socioeconomic background. And here I wanted to show you basically that you see this is a very strong association across countries. And we again are here somewhere in the middle. Nothing to write home about. You would say we are our parity index, that is a measure here on the x-axis of how equitable a society is. We're not very equitable, according to this graph. And the other one is achievement. However, when we dig a little deeper, so this is a graph that is, I have seen that very often used, but this is the one I like much better. So here we have on the axis here, that's the mean score in the science test 2015. And on the x-axis here, this is here whether we are below in terms of equity, and here's we are above in terms of equity from the overall average. So this is the overall average, and that makes this little crosshair. And guess what? When we look at this from that perspective, the United States is actually surprisingly in the positive quadrant. So we have above average science performance, slightly above, also slightly above. I showed you data from 2009 earlier that we were slightly below, but now we have improved, so we're slightly above. And as a matter of fact, we actually are above average in terms of equity in education. So when you see it from that perspective, we're not doing that poorly that a lot of people think we do. As a matter of fact, our closest neighbor here in this graph is of all countries, Sweden. Where you would always assume, oh, this is a country that is very equitable, very small social discrepancy. However, Sweden also has a pretty strong correlation between educational background of the parents and success of their own children. So one has to be always very careful in applying, stereotypical thinking here. So this is the first graph of a couple where I show you where you might, I hope you're surprised how fair, how good we're actually doing. that we fare pretty well by international comparisons. In particular, equity and excellence is something where most people, when I talk to, are very surprised to hear that we are not as bad as we think we are. But interestingly, since I'm also involved in this discourse on education in Germany, same story. Nobody hates the German system more than the Germans, right? And when I say, well, you have to put this in perspective. Yes, the German system has its problems, but it also has its strength. And then I stand there in front of the teachers' union and say, that's not true. It's all bad. It's all bad. It's well, from an international comparison, there are always strengths and weaknesses. And the US is no exception from this. There are some strengths that we have. In terms of equity by international comparisons, we do pretty well. It gets even better. Good news, good news. This is, between 2009 and 2016. Here is, whether the average science achievement has improved or decreased. So if you are in the positive side here, there's improvement. The United States has improved, not by much. But this part here, this is how much we have improved in terms of equity. How much the predictive power, how much you can explain achievement differences with differences in socioeconomic background has gone down in the United States, and that's a good thing. And you see that actually of all the countries, in this sample we are looking at here, we are one of the best in terms of, reducing the effect of socioeconomic background. It was very surprising. However, the trend is, it's not a fluke, because it was already in the last cycle of PISA 3 years earlier with math. We've seen in mathematics, we've seen the same thing. So a lot of US researchers are actually flabbergasted by that. How is this possible that we have made so much strides in this respect? And I don't have a real good answer to that, except that or many people claim that the introduction of standardized testing has helped. And I'm very reluctant to say that, but that we have a better monitored system, and the allocation of funding, Title I funding, for example, has improved, so that some argue there's not much real proof of that, but something has happened that has had positive effects on that. So in terms of trajectory, in terms of improving, the social injustice in our school system has gone down dramatically. And interestingly enough, that also applies if you break this up. Let's look here first on the right side first. This is immigrants. This is now a very different statistic. This is whether or not they basically complete high school. So I apologize for these terms, upper secondary education. We have to use terms that are internationally comparable, and that is a science in and of itself. So upper secondary, by and large means finishing high school. So in the United States, you see, we have not only a pretty high rate of finishing high school, not dropout of high school, it also is, if you break this down by immigration, first generation, second generation, and non-immigrants, the differences are almost non-existent. And there are other countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they have a much more discrepancy in terms of successfully, finishing high school between native-born Finns, let's say, first-generation immigrants and second-generation immigrants. So we are strong in this respect. And the same is also, this is now the socioeconomic background. Here you also see, yes, we do have effect of socioeconomic background, or is it in this case, let me be precise here. Yeah, this is about what educational degree the parents have. So we do see discrepancy. If your parents have a college degree, of course, the chances that the children finish high school is much, much higher. Not much, it's between 80 and 95%. So by comparison, if you look at the stair-steppy picture here, this is not as pronounced as it is, for example, in Belgium or even in Finland. So since we always get compared with Finland, so well, at least we don't have to bow our head in shame. It's like, no, since we have this high school graduation rate on that high level, yeah, it is, if you look at the absolute values, that, if the parents have low education, we still get over 80% to finishing high school. So in absolute terms, the American system does fairly well. So this graph here it leads me to the next topic, and that is, after high school. So This graph is, I have to explain this a little bit. This is, the adult population, in this case, only the 25 to 34-year-olds. What degree do they earn? And you see in the United States, we have tertiary education. Tertiary means at least associate degree, associate and up, associate degree, finishing college, master's level, and PhD. And so we are, on average, roughly a little less than 50% of our 25 to 34-year-olds, have that kind of education. And the younger you go, the higher the percentage. So we even, improving that still. Now I want to highlight first China. And look at China, you see that the percentage of a population that actually finishes with a tertiary degree, and that is an advanced degree that from the perspective of the OECD, reproduction of the workforce, extremely important because these are, among others, the engineers and the scientists. So you see that most of the Chinese population, and people always forget that most of the population in China is rural, is in the western part of the country, not in Beijing and Shanghai. And there is a lot of deficits. They have a lot of adults that still did not even finish high school. In Germany, and that is, of course, a country that I know pretty well, so for me it's always easy to compare the United States with Germany. Here you see something important and interesting is that the amount of people who actually have a formal tertiary degree is by comparison low, but they have a long bar here for upper secondary or post-secondary non-tertiary education. It's a mouthful. What this is the typical pedigree of German educational system that a lot of a high percentage of a birth year moves out of that typical college track. They go into vocational training, and the vocational training leads up to very high income and high degrees. And this is what I will show you in a second. So the US philosophy of education is we want to get everybody to finish high school. We want everybody to get, at best a college degree. And the success of our educational system is measured in how many kids we get into college. And this is something I want you to think about. This is really, a good idea. So that's where I wanted to compare, throw in Germany here. So those of the adults, young adults who have not gone the tertiary route, you see in Germany, almost all of them have vocational orientation, which vocational training in the United States is almost like an insult. It's only vocational. In Germany, it has a very different connotation. Vocational is also a career track, an alternative career track to the standard academic version of learning. For those of you not familiar with this, what happens is in Germany, if you go this route after grade 10, 9 or 10, you leave public education, you have a contract with a company, you work, you're part of the workforce, but at the same time, you have vocational training that is standardized. After 3 years, you become journeyman. You have a degree in a skill, in a trade that you can that transferred out of that company. It is not specific training for that particular company, but it's a trade that you learn that gets certified. Then once you're a certified journeyman, the union contracts kick in, and you have actually a pretty high income when you are in your early 20s. And this is the age when the differences between the United States and Germany are the largest with respect to lifespan development. Unfortunately, I had a slide in there I took out, from my own research. That's very fascinating that even life plans are affected by this. At the age of 21, German young women, they say, well, I will have my first child probably in the next 3 years. In the United States, you ask a 21-year-old in a very precarious employment situation, she'll say, I don't even think about children at this point. There's a strong difference in between that. If we have, in the US, if we have people who are not college-bound or in some college context, almost 100% of general education. It's not really, they go take community college classes, but it's not a coherent training, that leads to a degree that has, clear returns later. Yeah, and this translates very quickly into what I now dub the STEM challenge. And this is data from PIAAC. Now we're looking at 25 to 64-year-olds. So that's the age, where the vast majority of people are in the workforce. And now you see the surprise that Germany, despite the fact that it has a low percentage of tertiary degree, people who are in getting an advanced degree, you have the highest percentage of people who are actually in the STEMS field, science, technology, engineering, and math. So, and the reason is that in Germany there is this alternative career path that is held in high regards in the society, and it's not looked down upon from politicians or educators. In the United States, you see that we have surprisingly, by comparison, we are actually below average in this age group with people who are in the STEM fields. So there is a little bit of a disconnect between our push to tertiary education, but it does not translate into actually reproducing the need in the STEM fields. So this is, a lot of people are concerned about this, that our educational system is not as apt as reproducing the workforce that is particularly important in the industry. So Germany, surprisingly, is successful at that. And of course, you could now say, oh, that explains why Germany is economically doing so well. But we don't know. If I give this presentation 5 years from now, we have a big recession. I would still have the same slides. So I didn't say, yeah, that explains, how countries, do not fare well. But currently, that actually maps on nicely to economic success. So, this is now getting a little bit more subtle here. But this last slide also explains what we see here. Now I have to point you to Germany. So this is now the unemployment rates, whether you have a tertiary degree, whether you have not much more than at best an associate degree, or in Germany that would be vocational training. And the bar here, black bar, is below upper secondary. Let's start first with Germany. You see that if you have not finished high school, you're in trouble, high unemployment rate. But whether you have a master's degree or just a vocational training, the unemployment rate is the same. So with a decent, vocational training, standard, German training, you're pretty much protected from unemployment. If you look at the United States, now I have forgotten to label us here, you see that we have that what we would predict if you have a college degree, or even a master's degree, you have the lowest unemployment rate. If you have some college, you're in the middle. If you have not finished high school, you would do worse. So now I come to an issue that, I think I've said enough positive things about the United States. Agreed? Right? Good. So now we're talking, money and census. Yeah? So here we have, when we compare costs internationally, and this is for education, from 6th grade to 12th grade in this case, so all secondary education. And you see that the United States, where are we? I thought I had marked that here, maybe, yeah, here we are. Nothing spectacular. We're in between in terms of costs, nothing, out of the ordinary. Secondary education is as expensive or, not as expensive as in other countries. And I will not go into the details how, we did the magic here to translate this onto the same scale. But the OECD is very good at this. This is called purchasing power parity. That's the score. So this is pretty fairly done. So the United States does not stand out. So if you wanted this good news, because when you hear all this discourse in the United States about how expensive the teachers are, because most of the costs are teachers here. More than 50% of all costs in all educational systems is paying for the teachers. When we have this political discourse about that the teachers make too much money in the United States, I hate to tell you there's no evidence of this from international comparative studies. At least not K to 12. So, as I said, actually here this is now a slightly different indicator, but the same message here. This is how much % of the general domestic product is invested into education, and here it's secondary education. You see the United States actually is a little below the average, but it's we're pretty good. But now comes when we look at tertiary education. And all of a sudden, the United States, has the highest percentage of our gross domestic product goes into higher education. Most of it is private investment. You know where I'm going with this, right? So here comes the next slide. And I have, this is the United States. These are costs. And here's this 21,000. This is where that actually is. This is what, private college education costs. But even public, we lead the pack in a negative sense. So the higher, and I call this a tuition chokehold. The United States, our tertiary education is too expensive, and that's, I'm ashamed to say that because it's basically my income, that I'm talking about. But it's not that we, as professors, make more money than internationally. I could have shown you that slide too, just to make sure that you don't, kill me, right? It's not, but it is just simply that our tertiary education is out of whack in terms of costs, and nobody's surprised by this. If you read an Arbor News or any newspaper, it comes constantly. And the problem is, it is true. It's not just that we feel it's expensive, it's in comparison to other countries. And, even, compared to my favorite comparison country here, Canada, you see it's substantially, lower. And in Canada, you can't even your private schools. They don't even have private schools. You pay public tuition, institution tuition. So this is bad. So we force our system that we channel everybody into higher education, get a college degree, get a master's degree, get a PhD. But at the same time, people pile up debt, and the system is actually, by comparison, let's say, to Western Europe, particularly to Germany, not really as optimal in terms of reproducing the workforce that we need. So we are kind of cornering us, through the cost. So this is really where our educational system is problematic. It's not the K-12 education. It is second, it's the tertiary education, so college and up, where we have a big problem. So then I often get the question, well, if we are so bad in college and it's also expensive, and so how come we still are so, so important in the world? So this graph is a little deceiving, but this takes into account the size of a population. So we always forget that, let's start with Finland. This is, if the world would be competitive, and we had the 15-year-olds in terms of achievement competing, on the world market of, 15-year-olds, in the workforce. It's very hypothetical. You would see that the Finnish kids that are, pretty high performing, they make only 0.6% of the population of the 15-year-olds. So they would not be, really, they would not be really a threat to our economy, because they could not take all the positions that we would fill with, let's say, engineers. But these are data from the PISA study. Those are 15-year-olds. But it's a good proxy for the problem that we see here. So this is China, but these are only 4 provinces of China, so this is artificially small. So the fact that we have, of all the high achievers, of top performers, we still have the largest share of top performers worldwide. However, China is coming big, because you've seen 15 slides ago, I showed you the degrees, the highest degrees in China. Only few people have really high degrees. So as the educational system in China will expand, and it will, that's the political, big push in China to do that, to increase the level of education. We also will see more high-achieving students and graduates. They will come on the market. So just quickly. So I hope so far I have convinced you that we can learn something from these international comparisons. So it's a lot of assumptions that we take for granted that, get questions when we look at these international comparisons, because other countries also have their problems. So, we, as I said, we do, at least with respect to K-12 education, we fare pretty well. Now I want to give you another positive example where we also do pretty well. This is a very busy graph. Let's start first with the right panel here, because here I have kind of, as I told you, I'm switching back and forth between the studies. This here is the TIMSS 2011 Mathematics, and this is just a gender difference, and I've just, without labeling the country, this is just how pronounced the gender difference is. either favoring boys or favoring girls. So you see, by just glancing at this, there is no such thing as a gender difference in math. It doesn't exist. It exists in each country, but overall, it levels nicely. It's almost, there's equity. So in the total sample of that study, the gender effect is almost negligible. However, how did that happen? However, there are some countries that have substantially, this year, by the way, is of all countries, is Turkey, where girls score way much higher than boys. And the United States, you see, well, we have a slight advantage for boys. It's not even statistically significant. It's actually, we're doing pretty well in terms of gender equity in the school system. We also do pretty well. This on the left side is reading, and I always, emphasize this. If there is a school subject where there are substantial gender differences, then it's reading comprehension. That's throughout the entire school career of people. I told you 30 is one school year. It's a third of a standard deviation. So on average, across all OECD countries, we have a gender difference in reading comprehension among 15-year-olds of 40, which is way more than one school year. You can see there is not a single country where that goes in the other direction. So it is across all various cultures we see that girls are just better at reading. But even there, look at the United States. Our gender difference is almost, it's only half the size of the overall average. So we're doing pretty well. So the gender difference in reading, the reading score, of course, is substantial in the United States, but compared to other countries, right? And of course, I can't help it. I have to point this out. Here, Finland. Huge gender difference. So it's, not all gold in Finland, right? Apart from the weather, there would be other reasons why I would move there, because I have a daughter, right? So I would not move to Finland. So the gender differences in math and science are actually, very equitable overall, but you see that countries differ substantially with respect to in what direction gender differences are and how pronounced they are, different from reading. So finishing high school in the United States also, I don't want to go into too much of the detail of how this is calculated, but you see, in the United States, we have the highest completion rate, almost no gender differences in completion of high school. Yes, go USA. Good. Yeah, we're doing very well in this regard. Well. And of course, now comes the rub, right? There is a downside, or it's a wrinkle here. And I'm sure, since you're citizens of Ann Arbor, we are, majority Democrats, you're not surprised to see these numbers here, that the gender gap in terms of income after you finished school, all equitable in the educational system. Now they hit the labor market, and this is where injustice kicks in. This is the percentage of income. On average, a woman makes only, who has, has only a high school degree, only makes 78% of the income of a comparable male. Clear? So where are we? United States, 65. If somebody has an upper secondary or post-secondary non-tertiary degree, meaning all the way between high school and associate degree, overall average, 78%, United States, 72%. Tertiary education, 74, 70. So we are pretty bad in terms of that income gap. So the school system is not to blame for it. We know that in terms of achievement, the girls do very, very well. Even I could show you data from college times also, there is, equity. It is basically the labor market that basically does not control income disparity between genders. And this, of course, is different from countries that have a more constrained, like look at Denmark, Germany, where there's a lot of legal constraints in gender equity and income. So companies cannot simply, and in particular if there's a more relatively larger field of public service is very regulated, and there can't be, it would be in Germany as unconstitutional as it would be in the United States, by the way, but we have it nevertheless that, given the same educational background, women just do not get the same amount of money. So I'm just saying, it's all nice and good how our educational system is doing, but it does not translate into equity in the workforce. Okay, income gender gaps, basically the same. I'm not gonna, do us, make us more depressed. But remember, coming back to my first slide here, so what do I think? Where we are as educational system overall, we are not outstanding. We are not innovative, an example for the world anymore, I have to say. In the early 1900s, between 1900 and 1920, the United States was the leading nation in education, hands down in everything. That was, the Dewey reforms. We led the educational reform to more practice-oriented teaching. We led the PIAAC way in terms of high school in mandatory years of schooling, all the way up, from 8 to 10 to 12 years, always ahead of the game. So now it's all more equitable. So we lost in this. If you look 100 years back, we've lost our edge here a little bit. But still, the strengths and weaknesses, they are very similar to other Western nations. And when it comes to K-12 education, I would say we are doing very well by comparison. When it comes to college education, not so much. There is, things to do. But the educational system, depending from where you stand, I think the representation of our educational system in the media, I'm trying to be very careful here what I say, is probably not an accurate representation of the quality of our educational system. So just to sum it up, so as I said, our school system is similar in its costs and efficiency to other Western countries, K-12, right, mind you. School achievement is slightly below, if you want to be pessimistic. But gender equity and immigrant integration is way above other nations. So we're doing very well in that respect. By international standards, tertiary education is outrageously expensive with unusual individualized risks because it's loan financed. Other countries, they have also loan systems, but these are federal loans that have zero interest or flexible, payment schedule. Our loans, we put the entire life risk on our, young people. This is, by all economic, reasoning, it makes no sense to do that. But that's a story for another presentation, right? But this is where our problem is. East Asian countries will become more visible in tertiary education, as I told you, as they progress and expand. They will be put more pressure on Western European and United States. We see this already in math and engineering. We clearly see that. If you look at the University of Michigan enrollments in master programs in engineering, you see a huge, expansion of Asian graduates who are just good. It's not that it's competitive and they get in because they have really, strong skills. But it's not about, because of the U.S. weakness per se, it's the demographic push to higher education. So what we see, if there's a shift, that does not necessarily reflect negative on the United States, but this reflects more positive on the demographic development of other countries. And the educational system of the United States is open, and this is a good thing. It has served us very well, so there is no real reason to change that. And now I'm making too much a political statement, which I want to avoid. But we don't have to be afraid of this, because when we take in people from China, Korea, who are really, bright and very well educated, we take advantage because we didn't pay the costs of the education. So from an economic perspective, if these people get integrated very well, which we have a good, strong tradition of, they actually benefit our economy. So it's not a zero-sum game. It actually will increase the strength of the American economy. And with this, I think I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
This program was recorded on December 18th, 2017 at the Ann Arbor District Library.